This meeting is being recorded.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Klein, and I'm the Executive Director of the Juvenile Justice Initiative. Apologies for not being on camera. I've been having a little technical issues, but it's my privilege to welcome you to today's forum on addressing the intersections of youth in the legal system and legal system involvement and homelessness. First, some quick housekeeping. I'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves by dropping your name and organization into the chat. And we're going to begin with the presentation on the CJJ report, for which this forum is named. And it'll be followed by a reflection from personal reflections from two people who were impacted by the juvenile justice system, and then a panel discussion, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. If you have a question during the panel, please leave it in the chat, and we'll do our best to get as many as we can at the end. So now let me introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Mark Brown. Mark is a veteran columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times and has written extensively about issues surrounding homelessness throughout his career. Mark, take it away.
Thank you very much, Luis. Let me also thank all of you for showing your interest in this very important report. I've gone through it a couple times to try to absorb everything. But let's get right to it. Let me introduce you to today's presenters who have had a hand in preparing it. We have Naomi Smoot-Evans, Executive Director of the National Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Naomi has a law degree from the University of District of Columbia. Prior to joining the coalition, Naomi represented young people in Virginia and in the district in juvenile court proceedings and special education matters. Before attending law school, Naomi worked as a print journalist for nearly a decade, amassing nearly a dozen awards for her news coverage. We also have Darla Bardine, Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. Darla has dedicated her career to young people and families who experience homelessness, poverty, violence, and exploitation. Darla also has a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Take it away, folks.
Thanks, and thank you for having us with you today. We started our work at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice in youth homelessness and the related space because we saw that there was a real intersection between, you guys are watching me struggle with the tech here, between youth who were experiencing homelessness and young folks who were coming into contact with the legal system. From that, we started a partnership with Darla and her team at the National Network for Youth, along with the National League of Cities, about 6 years ago. And that project has spawned what we'll talk about today, the Principles for Change, which we hope communities across the country will embrace and implement in their work. Just to sort of frame us up really quickly, what are we talking about in terms of scope of this issue? Around 4.2 million young people each year experience homelessness. That's according to Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And that includes everyone who is couch surfing, who is doubled up, who is sleeping in a car. It's not just young folks who we think of in the traditional sense, who are, maybe with mom or with dad, but it's, young folks who are on their own and in a variety of different circumstances. 1 in 30 youth between 13 and 17 will experience homelessness in a given year. And in 2019 alone, to frame up our youth legal system numbers, as many of you on this call know, right, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the number of young folks who are coming into contact with the youth legal system, but still around 696,000 kids came into contact with the legal system in 2019 alone. I'm going to frame a little caveat there that that's our pre-pandemic last data point, right? So 2020 and 2021 numbers we're still waiting to see, and they may look a little bit different, but that's our pre-pandemic number. And there's been research that shows that there is an overlap between these populations. Interviews with about 654 young folks in 11 cities across the country showed that about 44% of young people who participated in those interviews had stayed in a jail, a prison, or a juvenile detention center at some point. About 78% of them said that they'd had at least one interaction with law enforcement as well. And even more of them had been arrested at some point also, right? And we know that not everybody who comes into contact with the legal system will also experience homelessness, but we know from these numbers and this research that there is a large overlap between those two populations. The question still remains, and the data is still out there on, is this something that's happening before or after system involvement? And the answer is both and, right? Sometimes it's a situation where a young person is experiencing homelessness, may have been forced out of their home or run away from home to flee an abusive situation or any number of circumstances. And because they're out on the streets, they may be criminalized either for being out after curfew or charged as a runaway, or engaging in survival acts like stealing food, trespassing to have a warm place to sleep at night. Many different things that can happen to bring somebody into the legal system when they're experiencing homelessness. The flip side is also true though, right? So we in the legal system have an opportunity to protect young folks from ever experiencing homelessness, because we in the legal system have an opportunity to sort of rethink the way we're doing things so that we can make sure that participation or involvement with the legal system is not a point that's going to result in housing instability for young folks. And that can be anything, right? From being on probation and having limits on where you can live at, which maybe you can't find housing. You're 17, 18, 19 years old and you're having trouble finding housing. Or a landlord has said, no, you can't stay here, you have a record. And mom is forced to make that sort of Sophie's choice decision of, do I let Johnny come home and put the rest of the family in danger of losing their housing? Or do we try to find someplace else? Or do we stick together and not have a place? So there's a lot of difficult choices that can come from having a record, even in the youth legal system. Again, not everyone who is in the youth legal system is going to be involved in the justice system, and vice versa. But we do see that the disproportionality that we see in the youth legal system is also there in the youth justice system. Black and brown youth are overrepresented in both systems, as are LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth. And because of this, one of the things that we highlight in the principles throughout them is just making sure that programs that are being made, that changes that are being made to policy are being made in a way that is equitable, that is trying to reduce and eliminate those disproportionalities, and is not causing further disproportionality to result, right? A lot of the reforms that we've seen in the youth legal field, they've been great, but in many cases, they've exacerbated those disproportionalities that have already existed. So while we're thinking about these intersectionalities, we want to make sure that we're solving the problem and not compounding it even further. Some of the other disproportionalities that we see, right? There's more young folks with physical, behavioral, and cognitive disabilities who are involved in both of these systems. And recent immigrants are also more at risk to be experiencing youth homelessness. So when we're thinking about what our solutions can be, just want to frame that up so that we are thinking about who we're serving and who we're trying to help with these solutions that we're putting together. The principles for change really have two focuses, right? Making sure that young people aren't criminalized for experiencing homelessness, and that if they do come into contact with the legal system, that they exit to safe, stable, and secure housing. Underlying every single piece of what we're going to be talking about today is two additional pieces, right? So we want to make sure that the work we're doing is addressing and not further exacerbating disproportionality. And we also want to make sure that young folks are at the table, having a voice, and leading in shaping these solutions that we're talking about, right? That young folks should have they have a vested interest in this, they have expertise in what's going on, and they have current knowledge about what's working and what's not, and need to be in those conversations at every stage of the process. I'm going to talk to you briefly about a few of the principles that are included in the principles for change. Principles one is ensuring that policies in your jurisdictions don't lead youth experiencing homelessness to be cited, arrested, or charged for survival acts or quality of life offenses, right? These are often low-level behaviors, like I mentioned before, that can be as simple as, going on somebody else's property so you have a warm place to stay at night, or in the summer months, a cooler place to be out of the heat. It also includes running away from home, being in parks or encampment laws. All of those components are ways that young folks are criminalized for experiencing homelessness. So we want to make sure that we're rethinking those policies as well. One other way that we've seen in our technical assistance working with communities across the country, sort of those catch-all unruly provisions, unruly or not following the rules or incorrigibility, all of those are often also used for young folks who've left home to either criminalize them or bring them into the legal system. So one of the things that we're calling on here is for folks to change those laws to make sure that a lack of stable housing is not resulting in criminalization, but is instead a basis for a way for young folks to get services, and to get services without being drawn farther into any system, whether that's the legal system, whether that's the child welfare system, because that's definitely another player that we need to be thinking about as we're talking about these intersectionalities. Rethinking those laws around loitering, camping, sleeping in public spaces so that young folks can get services instead of being criminalized. Also, truancy is a huge one that we see across the country. Making sure that young folks who are missing school, particularly if they're missing school because of a lack of stable housing, right? Maybe mom would have to drive them an extensive way to get back to their home school because they're having to double up with a family somewhere else that's farther away, making sure that they're not being criminalized for those truancy issues. And prohibiting confinement as a solution to a form of housing, right? I think everyone on this call knows that a detention facility comes with a lot of dangers. It is not a safe place. It is, even in the best of times before COVID, there were a number of dangers for detention facilities, ranging from physical abuse to sexual exploitation of young folks. And so the last thing that we want to be doing is putting our young folks in a detention facility in order to say that we're giving them a place to stay. So Darla is going to talk to you a little bit more in a minute about kind of what that can look like, right? How we can provide sort of a wraparound so that we have a way to make sure that young folks are getting services and supports and not being placed in detention. And the last thing that we need to be doing when we're faced with a young person who is experiencing numerous challenges is placing fines and fees on top of the other challenges that they already have, right? If mom and dad and the young person don't have money to pay rent now, if we add restitution and we add fines and fees onto that, it's going to make that situation even more complicated for that family to get out of that hurdle. And I don't know what's going on with my computer, if you guys can see this email that keeps flashing up, but I apologize if you do. Principle 2 is ensuring that young people are diverted from the legal system whenever possible. That diversion should happen as soon as possible. It should be outside the scope of probation. It should be, when we're talking about diversion, ideally it's no paper, so that law enforcement doesn't come back and say, yeah, but this kid, like they did X and they got diversion last time and they didn't learn anything, and now I need to do something more serious, right? So as early in the process as possible, and no paper whenever possible for diversion. Making sure that it's a connection with services and a connection with supports, and that diversion is being carried out in a way that works for young folks who may not have stable housing, who may have challenges getting to placement, and I think to programs. And I think there's another opportunity here for us to also rethink how we're doing diversion, right? We don't need to be making kids go 2 communities over to get to diversion, putting programs in the community and partnering with the community for those services so that, once a young person is out of contact with the legal system or something else has happened, the community can still work to support them through those programs. They're still there and they're still in place. One thing that the Annie Casey Foundation has been working really hard on in recent years is trying to make sure that sanctions are not tied to diversion, right? Diversion should be a way to help a young person get back on track, get to a successful life, not a way for them to incur more sanctions and more problems. And whenever I talk about this particular issue, I think about a young person that I worked with when I was doing direct services. Great kid, was on probation, and on the way to a movie theater on a Saturday with his family, smacked his sister upside the back of the head, jokingly, right? Like my brother and I did on a regular basis. But because he was on probation, that was enough for him to catch a violation of his probation and then end up in a detention facility. So really thinking through how can we uncouple those sanctions and make sure that we're giving young folks services and supports and not pulling them deeper into the system. The third principle that we talk about is making sure that, in the event that you absolutely cannot avoid involvement with the youth legal system, making sure that there's a comprehensive transition plan in process. And that transition planning should begin immediately, right? Without proper planning, we're setting our young folks up for even more challenges and even more struggles. When we talk about transition plans, we mean making sure that the backup to the backup to the backup plan is there, right? So that if I am leaving a detention facility on Tuesday, I am equipped and know that I am going to go to my mom's house, but if I get in a fight with mom's boyfriend, I can safely go to this second location with my best friend's house. And then also having that other backup plan there, right? So that if my best friend and I get in a fight, I then have that third option, because we want to make sure that those multiple plans are in place for our young folks up front, so that we're not asking them in a moment of trauma, in a moment of stress and anxiety, to figure out, where am I going to stay tonight, right? We want to have the supports in place so that those decisions are there and they have a plan that they can act on when things go sideways, as life often does. It should include more than just housing though, right? We want to think about all the many things that our young people need, and that could include housing, that could include employment, that could include childcare. If it's a young person who's also a parent, it can include, how are we going to get credits transferred back from this placement and to a young person's school. And then I would also encourage you to think of transition planning, not just when we're talking about detention facilities, but also when we're thinking about probation, right? Because a lot of times our kids have conditions included in their probation that they have to live in a certain area. And that helps no one if that young person has a record and then can't find housing in that area. And we have then set that young person up for homelessness. So helping them as well when they're on probation to try to find housing that works, housing that's willing to work with young people who are still on probation or who may have previously had a criminal record or some other involvement with the legal system. And also partnering with families as a part of this, right? A family as defined by that young person, when it's safe to do so. For not every young person is going to want to or should go back to a family, but when they are interested in going back to and living with their family, partnering with the family as part of this reentry process as well. And in jurisdictions that allow for post-disposition representation, we also encourage that those defenders are there as part of that process as well. Darla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Hello, everybody. My apologies. I have a bit of a cold. Hopefully I don't sound too stuffed up. So I'm going to talk about Principle 5, which is to ensure that your community provides youth and families with related services and supports that can help them obtain and keep safe and stable housing. So like Naomi has been talking about, young people who experience homelessness and those who are at greatest risk to experience homelessness need access to services. It's essential that these services are available to help them to successfully transition to adulthood. We know that young people at risk of and experiencing homelessness and the juvenile legal system face many barriers in their steep climb to adulthood, and they need to be connected to networks of support. So ideas would be included as part of access to short and or long-term housing, depending on the needs of that young person. And also, as part of this principle, there needs to be an assessment or analysis of each individual young person's skills and needs. We really talk about, strength-based, individualized assessments. There's definitely not one size fits all. And really having tailored services and supports for that young person and their family as appropriate is critical. I mean, we know that housing alone is not enough to serve all the needs that youth experiencing homelessness face. Ask any young person with lived experience, and they will tell you that they needed much more than just a safe and stable place to stay. Youth also may need access to services to help them heal from trauma. Research study after research study that showed no matter the pathway to homelessness for young people or their experiences while homeless, a history of trauma, both before homelessness and during homelessness, was pretty uniform for all young people. Also, young people need access to education and workforce development programs, while young people also need support as they are learning and preparing to live life as an adult. And there are an array of services that should be available to both youth and their families and guardians, or anybody really that young person identifies as family or a support person for them. Next slide, please, Naomi. So we know how important it is for there to be a multi-system, multi-service approach to really addressing the intersection of youth homelessness and legal system involvement. Schools are a critical partner to have at the table. Schools are critical to coordinate and collaborate with youth homelessness service providers. For those of you who may not be aware, there is the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act, which actually does give affirmative legal rights to students experiencing homelessness. Schools actually are required to identify all students experiencing homelessness, pre-K up through 12th grade, and to also ensure that that young person can continue to attend their school of origin, so the school they were attending, before they started experiencing homelessness, even as their address changes and would put them in different school districts. And schools are also mandated by law to provide transportation for that young person to maintain their school of origin, as long as it's in the best interest of the child. There are other legal rights, but schools are really critical partners and really critical in ensuring there is education stability, connection to education, transportation to education. Also, legal services need to be available to all young people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. Like Naomi shared, a lot of young people in homelessness situations do encounter law enforcement and the court system just simply because they are experiencing homelessness. And so there is a need for access to legal services. And these legal can also include, juvenile record sealing or expungement, assistance in accessing public benefits. So it can be very difficult for young people to sign up and access public benefits, especially if maybe a parent is still claiming them and receiving public benefits. Also, young people struggle with accessing vital docs and a valid government identification without having like your social security card or your birth certificate, or a government ID, it can be really hard to access public benefits, access employment, access housing, all of these things that are needed to live, as an adult or to live independently. Also, legal assistance with filing emancipation petitions. Also, combined funding streams can really allow providers to better serve youth. So it really can allow different community-based organizations to be able to offer a fuller array of supports and services to young people and their families. So for example, it may enable providers to hire staff members that are critical to serving young people, such as behavioral health specialists or having case managers on site. Case managers are really critical in terms of building relationships with young people for the long term, helping to develop individualized case plans and service plans for that young person and that family. And really having, an established relationship with someone who really cares goes a long way. We hear from the young people with lived experience that we work with that having that person who truly cared and maintained a genuine relationship with them over the long term really made the difference for them in being able to sustainably exit homelessness. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about transition planning, and in particular, why transition planning is so important in ensuring that youth and families are connected to the supports and services they need. This quote is from a publication that my organization wrote with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Targeting release from the juvenile justice system is a point to combat youth homelessness can benefit, and it can benefit both youth who are at risk of displacement as well as reduce rates of youth recidivism. So reduce the percentage of youth that re-enter the juvenile justice system. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? Naomi talked a little bit. So re-entry and transition planning and services should connect all young people to healthcare that is specific to their needs. And in particular, professionals, typically it's case managers or transition planning officers, professionals should identify and refer youth who are LGBTQ to health providers who are culturally competent and can meet their healthcare needs. For example, to refer a young person living with HIV to HIV-related care. Also, transition plans need to address the long-term housing stability of each young person. And transition planning should not start a few days or even a few weeks before a young person is going to be released. We've seen best practices that transition planning starts on the first day of a young person being placed in secure detention. And in a federal law I'm working on now, we're stating it very clearly that transition planning should be written collaboratively with young people, not a transition plan written for a young person, but with them. And agencies, we don't want, nobody should just be checking a box. Don't just ask a young person, hey, do you have a place to sleep the night after you leave this secure detention, or even for a week. But instead, to really ensure that that young person has a place to stay, a safe and stable place to stay for until they are transitioning to adulthood. And with resources and information on where to find or how to keep a place to live. So often in practice, that looks like, okay, there's a plan A, but then there's also maybe a plan B and C when it comes to housing. Like if this doesn't work out, here's a plan B, or get in touch with me, we'll help you. Having that conversation. And also knowing that transition plannings when it comes to services, because we know housing alone is not enough, is to ensure that there is available strength-based family counseling available to address high conflict relationships, and to also offer education and vocational services. It could also include planning for behavioral health care after system involvement. Next slide, please. So our principles for change, there are, I think, 9 now, if I am correct. Naomi and I only went over, I think, 3 today, but we encourage you to check out the full publication. But in summary, this is really a critical framework that is actionable, that can be implemented to really address the intersection between homelessness and legal system involvement for youth. And it is essential to not criminalize behaviors that are the result of a young person's lack of housing. Instead, the response should be providing young person with the housing and the supportive services and connections to caring adults. Also, the services need to be provided for both the young people and their families. Also, like we've talked about, re-entry planning is crucial. The 4th thing is keeping records confidential. Can families housed together? Naomi talked about how having a criminal record can limit access to housing. It can be a reason why folks are not able to stay in public housing. It can be a reason for a landlord not to rent or to stop renting to a young person or a family. And also in all the policy transformations that you're involved in, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level, partnering with, sharing power with, and collaborating with youth with lived experience is absolutely critical. We do this work in communities across the country, and young people with lived experience always bring up the hard conversations and bring up the tough issues that really need to be addressed to make the type of change that we know needs to be made, and to ensure that in all the policies and all the work that you're each seeking to transform have got to be culturally competent. They have got to address the needs of youth of color and LGBTQ youth who are overrepresented in the youth homelessness population, as well as our legal system. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Think we can hear you now, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I muted myself. I was getting some unwanted noise there. We had booked this section of the presentation for another 15 minutes. I having trouble communicating with my fellow team members here. I wondered if we want to open it up to a few questions from these folks who clearly have an expertise that probably ought to be tapped. I'm just wondering if any of our panel members, I know our panel members haven't been introduced yet, but I wonder if they have any questions for our 2 presenters.
So we did get a question asking about the different approaches or strategies for homeless youth who are minors versus those who are emerging adults, which would be between 18 and 24. So what are some of the challenges that are unique to the emerging adult population? For example, availability of housing, or is use and availability of monetary and cash supports a critical element for older youth? So that would be for either Naomi or Darla.
I think I caught most of that. Basically, challenges in access to housing for older youth. Did I get that? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's definitely a shortage of housing for young people experiencing homelessness. There was actually a GAO study released earlier this year that actually found that there was a critical lack of housing for minors experiencing homelessness, and that when there is housing and services available for young people, it does tend to be young people 18 and older, because it's cheaper. Technically, they're adults. So when it comes to state licensing requirements, the staff to youth ratio is higher. You don't have the parental consent issues for 18 and older. So by and large, I think minors face the most barriers and lack the most housing options for legal reasons and also funding reasons. But even for 18 and older, there is a critical lack of housing options. And even when there are for many young people, that it's very difficult for them to find a landlord willing to rent to them, given the housing shortage, that if a landlord has a then they're not going to be rented to. And I think that that barrier becomes even more compounded when there is a legal record. There's just so many reasons, and it makes it very easy for folks to not rent to young people. I think that was most of the question. Let me know if there's anything else.
We have another question here. Someone would like to know if you could, one of you could discuss the challenges and examples of successful responses in rural communities.
Rural communities are always a challenge in terms of connecting folks with programs and services generally, right? Things that might be just a short bus ride or a walk away in a more compact and urban community are much harder for folks in rural communities to get to. And often there's more challenges related to funding. There have been a number of federal grant initiatives recently focused specifically on rural communities and trying to get those dollars out to rural communities so that they can have more services and supports. There's also been some success with what's called host homes. They're basically exactly what they sound like, right? Homes that folks have contracted with, where there is a place where a young person can go and stay when they're in a situation where they don't have stable housing. And Darla, I know you all have worked with host homes in the past. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about them.
Yeah, host homes have definitely been implemented successfully, and there's different types of host homes. Some are like stranger matches, right? So it's a couple or a person that has agreed to, host young people in need of housing, usually for a short period of time. It's typically not like a 2-year long-term housing arrangement, though it does grow into that based on relationships that develop between the young person and the youth. But I would say more commonly in rural communities, and there's a 5-county collaborative in Wisconsin that actually does a lot of kind of kinship host homes. So it's not foster care. It's just someone that the young person already knows or is connected to, like best friend's family, auntie, grandma. And they serve as a host home, a temporary place to stay. But then those hosts and that family, they get some financial resources, they get some support, as well as the young person. And the other kind of successful thing I've seen, tending to be in smaller communities in terms of keeping young people experiencing homelessness out of the legal system, is actually having a written MOU between the sheriff or the police department and the local community-based youth homelessness service provider. And the agreement is usually like a status offender or a young person who's trespassing because they're experiencing homelessness or they need connection to services, there's a written MOU that the police will take the young person directly to the community-based organization. So there's no arrest record, there's no ensnarement, and there's actually like a formal written agreement between that police department and then, you know, either one or two or three an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. It's like kind of like a contract, but it's a formal written signed agreement. Where we've seen those agreements change usually is when there's a change in leadership. If there's a change in who the chief is, that's when we've seen that change. But we've seen it in some communities for decades.
I have another question. A friend of mine who was much more involved with the legal system and how this plays out than I am said that the problem here in Cook County is that the young person comes before the judge at the beginning of a case, and it's pretty clear often right from the start what some of the issues are, and yet we don't get around to addressing those issues and what we're going to do until the sentencing phase, when we ought to be getting at it right from the minute they come through the door. Is that your experience around the country? Do you know that whether or not we have a particular problem in that regard here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always one of the challenges, right? Helping judges understand that we need to be addressing those underlying issues, taking the time to ask the questions to get to those root causes, but then addressing them as early on as possible. And the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has done a great job in helping to educate their members about the importance of asking those questions to help identify, you know, is a young person experiencing homelessness, right? And so it can be as simple as like, do you have a key to the place you're staying, right? Maybe the young person doesn't consider themselves to be experiencing homelessness, but needs support so that they can have something permanent and stable, and that they can, you know, have a key to, that they can come and go as they please and as they need to. So helping judges understand that is definitely a big part of it. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges a couple of years ago passed a resolution that mirrored the principles for change that we can share as a follow-up to this document if there are judges who would find it helpful. But you know, there's also a roadmap that we've created as part of the project to help think through, right? What are those key questions that judges can be asking, that defense attorneys can be asking? Because even building that rapport with your own client can be, you know, it can take some time, and it might not be day one when you meet with that young person that they're going to share everything with you and, you know, let you know the whole scope of what it is that they need to be successful.
And then we've got one more question here from our audience, and then we'll move ahead. Someone wants to know, are there any examples of success in helping system-involved young people and their families get more permanent housing? Emergency shelters and short-term resources, while very important, can't meet the longer-term needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Where we've seen the most success is that there's both a short and a long-term plan happening at the same time. You're meeting kind of the crisis, short-term housing and service needs of young people, while you're planning for what is the long-term. Are there barriers to address in helping a young person or a family access permanent housing, right? Is it previous evictions? Is it a legal record? Is it access to vital docs, right? How do we increase their income? Can we get them signed up for public benefits? Are we asking them what their education and career goals are, and then helping set up a plan in place, access to college, access to other training programs so they can achieve upward economic mobility, right? And all of these conversations kind of need to happen at the same time while you're ensuring there are those therapeutic services to address that underlying trauma, because you're going to keep seeing that trauma come up and up, right? And then I think once you are aware of what are those barriers, what are the needs, what are the goals, you just, you keep supporting people where they are and help them try to get in, whether it's affordable housing, whether they're living in transitional housing for a couple of years while they're increasing their education and employment skills so they can get a job and pay their rent. I think too often conversations are all about, affordable housing, which is critical, but thinking of, Section 8 public housing, which can be obviously very critical, but also, young people and families have education and career goals, and we should support them to be able to meet their goals and dreams, right? While addressing all of the other things. And definitely there is some interesting work being done to test or get data around, cash transfer programs for youth experiencing homelessness. I think we're all pretty excited to see kind of the outcomes and the results of those, the cash-based work that Chapin Hall is doing. We've seen an increase in tax benefits, the earned income tax credit for homeless and foster youth. That was for the first time this year, stimulus checks. I think that getting cash to young people through the tax system is not the best way to go. A lot of young people are being claimed by their parents fraudulently, and it does pose some barriers. But I think there is a lot of promise in cash-based interventions. And there's just the barrier of at what age can a young person sign a lease, and just making sure that we're not setting young people up to get an eviction, that they do have the support. If they do need, cash assistance to pay rent or, for a couple of months, I think there needs to be flexible funding available in communities to meet whatever the needs of a young person is in order to help them gain stability and then maintain that for the long term.
Well, thank you very much, Darla and Naomi. I think we could all hear not only your knowledge of this subject, but also your passion coming through in your voices. I want everyone to know I've heard the same passion in the voices of our panel members as we prepared for the panel today. I don't know if there's an applause on the Zoom, but I'll give my applause. So now we're going to hear some personal reflections from two of our panelists who have had firsthand experiences with the issues we are addressing here today. I'd like to introduce you to Andrea Hall. Andrea is Executive Director to the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission. The commission is made up of individuals appointed by the governor. It distributes federal funds for juvenile prevention and intervention programming and advises the governor, legislature, and director of the Department of Human Services on juvenile justice issues. Andrea has over 15 years experience engaging and mobilizing communities to advance equity and social justice issues. She's joined by Deja Smith. Deja is representing the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. Deja is a Mississippi native and a Christian trans woman of color who advocates based on her former experiences as a juvenile inmate, sex worker, and homeless youth. She shares her stories in the hope that they will help to inform, liberate, and equip others living in similar situations. Thank you very much. We'll turn it over to them. I think Andrea, you're first.
Yes, thank you, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Drea Hall, and I am the Executive Director of the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission. When I listened today to the presentation and the principles, I could not help but think of my own story of experiencing homelessness growing up on and off from age 5 to 20 years old. High school was one of my worst moments I have experienced. When I was a freshman in high school, I lived in a shelter with my single mom. I was actually doing really well in school, playing multiple sports and even attaining decent grades. However, that drastically changed when my school principal told me that because I did not live in the school boundary, I was not allowed to go to school there anymore unless we moved back into the school boundary within 60 days. He was aware that I lived in a shelter, and it did not matter. I ended up switching schools because you cannot put a time frame on homelessness. And back then, McKinney-Vento was either just being implemented or wasn't around, so there was definitely no one to advocate for me. At the new school, I stopped playing sports and my grades fell dramatically. Even when my mother and I were rehoused, I still felt down and unseen. So these feelings and pressures led me to make bad decisions, and that led me to be arrested and taken to jail and charged as an adult at age 17, going on 18 years old. I was a senior in high school at the time. I would like to say my involvement with the system was a rule, but it was instead an exception. My mother couldn't believe they charged me as an adult for a low-level offense. She tried to ask them to change me to juvenile court, but they did not. I was about to turn 18 years old, so they felt justified. Our story did not matter. In adult court, I was surprisingly given some sort of diversion programming. If I completed probation, then my case would be dismissed. I did just that. My final year in high school, while I was on probation, I completed all the requirements of that. And luckily, I had a probation officer who wanted to see me succeed. And he supported me in my last year in school. As I said, I wish my story my story of diversion was the rule. However, in many cases, it's the exception. If I would not have been offered the diversion programming opportunity, I would not have been able to seek and complete my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in social work. And I probably would not be here with you today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Deja, who will also share some of her reflection. Deja.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark stated, my name is Deja Smith. I'm representing the coalition, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. So I'm a Mississippi native. I moved to Chicago for better opportunities, better equality, better just Mississippi is like a really slow pace. So I needed something. Me and my mom, we needed something that was faster. So we moved here to Chicago. Upon Chicago, we didn't know where we were going to stay or where we were going to live. And so we lived with a family member. And so I was subject to go out and provide for me and my mother. And so I went out and provided and met a person that got both of us in trouble. And at the time I was 17 years old, or 18, turned 18 in 2 months. And so they charged me as an adult at 17. And so I went to Cook County, where I was sentenced to PC, protective custody, and it's for LGBTQ, trans, and gender non-conforming, where it's a facility, a unit where people like me or people that identify as me will be protected. It wasn't really protection there. It was the same stuff that I think would be in another unit. Officers will talk about you, they will misgender you, they will make fun of you, you're this, but you're born this way, but you're this. And so it was very hard for me to be in jail. And I was fighting a case that was not for me for 4.5 years, not having anyone come talk to me, not having anyone come, see about me, or not having anyone to do anything. And so I was just subject already, coming from the streets, homeless, being in jail, I would say homeless. And so I was just fighting for my life. And upon trial, I had to go to trial, and I beat the trial. And upon trial, they didn't really give me an incentive, a plan. They didn't give me anything. They just told me, you're free, go home. So I went home and I was subject again, coming in homeless, in jail homeless, and leaving again homeless. And so I had to sleep on the public transportation, on the CTA train and buses for about 3 months. And it was it was horrible because again, I was LGBTQ, I was trans, I was Black. So I was getting lashed from society. I was getting beaten. I was getting robbed. People was subjected for me to do sexual favors because that's all they thought I was, I'm trying to survive. And really that's all my mind was thinking was, I'm in survival mode, that I have to survive, that I need to survive because I don't have anybody. My mom went back to Mississippi while I was in jail. And so I was here in Chicago by myself, living by myself. And so having all these different obstacles will lead you back to doing stuff to go back to go back to prison. And so finally my family reached out to me and was like, you can come stay with us. And so I stayed with them, but I was still subject to going back because I had to abide by their rules. I had to do what they told me to do, or either their way or the highway. I didn't have any freedom. And so my family didn't help me either. Like I needed identification, I needed social security card, I needed a birth certificate, I needed assistance. And so I was still navigating to try to not go back to where I came from. So I had to push through all this. And current now I'm still facing homelessness at 24. Except for I'm just living with my best friend. And so this is really passionate for me because working with the Coalition for the Homeless, I see so much, and I am a youth, and I'm LGBTQ, and I'm transgender, and it's really hard for not only just me, but for people that's my color, even that's not a racist thing or anything, but people who's fighting, who's youth, who's LGBT, who's not LGBT, it's hard trying to navigate from the jail system to being homeless, being youth. A lot of opportunities are not out there for us. It's hard to get opportunities when you've been in the jail system for so long, when your name been slandered, when you've been talked about, when people well, all thing she's gonna do is go back to jail, or all thing they're gonna do is steal again. So yeah, that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Deja.
Thank you, Deja. Thank you, Drea. I'm sure most of us can appreciate, the level of courage it takes for both of you to stand up here and tell your stories. So thank you very much. Now we're going to bring in the rest of the panel before we start our discussion. Let me introduce Carrie Reuter Carrie, I almost messed up and went from the wrong sheet here. Carrie Reuter with us today, representing the Illinois Department of Human Services, where she is an associate director for the Division of Family and Community Services. Carrie has more than 25 years experience administering prevention, intervention, and diversionary programs for the state of Illinois, serving youth ages 6 to 24. We also have Dre Kultz, Chief Development Officer, LYTE Collective, and former high school art teacher. She has over 15 years of diverse experience supporting young people in situations of poverty and homelessness through direct service, advocacy, resource procurement, and community collaboration. And finally, we have Flora Koppel, President and CEO of Unity Parenting and Counseling. With a MSW, Ms. Koppel has an extensive career spanning innovative substance abuse treatments in New York City, also domestic violence, suicide prevention and homeless services with what's now the Heartland Alliance in Chicago, and also over 2 decades of programming and services for homeless youth through her work at Unity. Ms. Koppel is also chair of the Youth Committee for the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. So basically, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to keep our focus on the principles highlighted in the report and ask each of the panelists to share their insights. And we're going to go back. We're going to start with Drea. Drea, on principle 1 states that jurisdictions should ensure that their laws and policies do not lead youth experiencing homelessness to be arrested or cited or charged for survival or quality of life issues. And principle 2 urges that jurisdictions divert young people from justice systems whenever possible. Our question for you is, what can Illinois do to operationalize these principles? And if I may, because I hate the word operationalize, just let me translate. How do we put this into use?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Mark. So as a youth who experienced homelessness on and off in high school, there was a lot of times where I was seen by the police because I was on the streets. I did a lot of walking. Sometimes I had no place to go, and I was one of the few African Americans in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I stood out a lot of times, and some police knew my story and my mother's struggles, and others never tried to understand. So if I got in trouble for survival crimes, my housing instability was never taken into consideration. I feel it needs to be. We need more programs that deflect youth from even penetrating the system in the first place. We need more short-term housing solutions so youth who are engaged in survival and quality of life issues can first be referred to programming before the legal system. Screening tools can be helpful and improved. First engaging with the youth to determine their needs and appropriate need for services. As a homeless youth, no one really knew but my close friends or some adults. It is something I trusted with people. It was something I did not really trust with people, especially law enforcement. So having a dual outreach plan may be helpful when responding to a call on a homeless youth. So a social worker accompanying a police officer can collaborate to meet those needs of the youth and address safety issues at the same time. We definitely need to rethink how we respond to the homeless youth who commit crimes of survival. For principle number 2, the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission, where I work, we wrote a white paper entitled Preventing Youth Arrests Through Deflection, Best Practices and Recommendations. And Betsy Clark may drop it at the chat at some point in here where you can find this paper. We will make sure everyone gets it. So in the paper, the commission defined the difference between deflection and diversion. Deflection refers to policies, practices, and programs that prevent youth arrest and court involvement and link youth to supportive services in the community. It essentially occurs in lieu of arrest. So no arrest made. Diversion, on the other hand, refers to the redirection of the youth, legal's case, from further processing in the legal system at any point. We should know the difference and advocate for deflection in lieu of arrest, if that is possible, and take safety into consideration as you're making these decisions. And I'll just point out, we have 5 pillars when it comes to deflection. 1, effective deflection occurs instead of not following arrest. 2, the decision between counsel and release or referral services must be informed by research, guided clear criteria, developed with an implicit focus on addressing racial disparities in arrest, deflection and referral to services. Services must be voluntary, high quality, and focused on positive youth outcomes. So when I was going through probation and they asked me to do things voluntarily, I felt like it could help me versus them telling me you have to do this. Services must be provided and be age appropriate for the youth and be located hopefully within the youth's area so they can access them. And law enforcement decisions to arrest or deflect, as well as subsequent service provisions, should be transparent enough for effective programmatic oversight and accountability. And lastly, law enforcement decisions to arrest or deflect, as well as subsequent service provisions, should be transparent to ensure effective programmatic oversight and accountability. I encourage you to read the report and learn more about these pillars on deflection models and the recommendations. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Drea. I just want to remind our audience members, we're hoping to have enough time left at the end for a question and answer. And so, but you need to submit them through the chat, and we'll try to get to them as we can. And also, I just want to encourage the other panel members here, as any, if on some of these principles you feel like you want to jump in too, please go ahead. Don't wait for me. So now we're going to go back to Deja. Deja, from your experience with the Coalition for the Homeless, can you talk about how to move forward on Principle 3, which is that comprehensive transition planning must begin immediately upon justice system involvement?
Yes. So like I stated in my reflection, I didn't have no one talk to me upon my arrival or upon my release for any any reflection or any like goals or plans or any re-entry. And so that led me back to being homeless and back to sleeping on the train. And so I think that's very important. Just upon arrival, when any youth is incarcerated upon arrival, that someone should be there to talk to them, get their ideas, get their goals, get their plans, get their achievements. Because in like incarcerated, like when we're being incarcerated, we don't know how long we'll be there for, because some stuff we just do and we have no remorse because we're in survival mode, and so we're trying to survive, and so we don't know how long we'll be there. And I was incarcerated for 4.5 years. I didn't know I was gonna be there that long. I thought I was gonna be in and out, but the judge told me, no, you're like crazy, you're a menace to society. So that led me to stay there for 4.5 years. And so I didn't have anybody to even help me plan re-entry even after leaving. I just was released and they said goodbye. And I didn't have no one saying, well, you're being released, we're gonna go. I didn't have anyone, even when I was out, I didn't have anyone call me or find me or even say, hey, let's do a follow-up, let's do a touch-up, let's meet, let's meet and talk about your plans. Let's get you a job, let's get you this, let's get you that. I had no one do that for me. And so I think that it's very important that Principle 3 talks about this, that like it needs to be a re-entry upon arrival and upon leaving, and even a follow-up too after, because that follow-up will help someone, encourage them to want to do better, encourage them to go out and strive for excellence, strive for the best.
So Deja, did you have a public defender?
First I had a public defender, and she wasn't my best luck. And so I had a paid lawyer, and she was also transgender. And so she helped me and she worked with me and she got me out of there.
Do you think if there'd like been a social worker working out of the public defender's office assigned to your case, that might have been something that would have helped?
I definitely think that they would have played a big part in a lot of ways. I just had my lawyer and I had my mom, and so that was on the two contacts I had. And so my mom was in Mississippi back home. My lawyer was in Chicago. She really couldn't, do nothing but just help my case. She couldn't, try to help me after, she followed up with me like after my upon release, but that was just about it. But if I had like a social worker or any type of assistance, I think that like my whole approach after being released, that it would have been different for me. I think I wouldn't be in the predicament that I'm, still in now. I think that it would be a totally different outcome if I had someone helping.
Well, thank you, Deja. And now we're going to go to Carrie Reuter. Carrie, what can the Department of Human Services do to put Principle 4 into operation to ensure our communities have both long and short-term safe housing options for justice system involved youth?
Thanks, Mark. So I think that there is a lot that the state can do in this area, as well as the others that we've heard so far related to diversion. diversion programs and programming and services in the community related to reentry and the rest. As we talk more specifically about housing, short-term, long-term housing, there's a number of things that we've done here in Illinois, and not to suggest that what we've done is sufficient, or adequate by any means, but we have done a pretty decent job here in Illinois at creating a system that is statewide, that is able to respond immediately to youth in crisis. And that's our comprehensive community-based youth services program. And they work with minor youths, right? So they work with youth that are the more difficult population, as we heard earlier, in being able to find resources, because it is more difficult to have a homeless program that serves minor youth versus adults. And so we at the state also fund a homeless youth program that currently just went out for a competitive bid. So if you want to put a plug in the chat, we can do that. So those two programs working together, our comprehensive community-based youth services program and our homeless youth program, are able to do a few things. So our CCBYS, as I'll refer to it, is our crisis intervention program. And so when we identify young people through any number of means, whether it be directly from a homeless program, whether it be from law enforcement, from the school system, from even if it's a direct referral, right? Even if it's the youth themselves, we're able to work with those kids 24/7 and respond to them. We are able to address their current situation. Maybe it's appropriate for us to try to help that youth return home. Sometimes that's not appropriate, but we have a system to respond that will provide emergency placements for those youth for a brief period of time, while we try to work towards longer term stable solutions for those youth. And our homeless program has three separate components to it. There's a street outreach component where we're able to try to identify youth and kind of bring them into the fold and provide some assistance. We try to provide more than just referrals and things of that nature, but we do try to address any immediate needs for those outreach youth. But for those youth who are homeless, but maybe have a roof over their head, even if it's temporary and they don't want to come into the system, we're able to still work with them and provide some case management services to them, to help advocate for them, to help work to whatever it is that those individuals need. We'll go through an assessment process and develop an individualized case plan and try to help them along their path. And we have an emergency shelter, interim housing portion of our homeless program. We also have a transitional living program, which is longer in nature. I think we heard from the national level that those programs can be up to 2 years in length. So we fund something similar here in the state as the Federal Youth Service Bureau does at the national level. And so we have a number of providers around the state that may have both programs, et cetera. But so we're able to try to work with those youth, advocate with those youth, help to stabilize them, provide them whatever kinds of resources that they may need to help move along the path we work towards. Education, whether it's getting the youth back in school, encouraging them and supporting them in training programs or further education. We try to work to develop employment skills, life skills, try to help get them employment. And then we also work on long-term stable housing. Because we work with a variety of age groups, so for our homeless program, we actually work with youth from age 14 up through age 23. Once they turn 24, we may be able to extend it a little bit, but not usually very much. So generally it's 14 to 23. And so we try to help those individuals by the time they leave. We hope to have them set on a stable path moving forward. At the Department of Human Services, we also operate some federal grant programs that provide things like rental assistance and other housing kinds of emergency items. But those are not Illinois specific. Those are programs that are done in other states as well. And as Drea and Deja have mentioned, you know, the issue, one of the issues that I think Deja brought up is related to planning, right? When we identify homeless individuals going into, whether it's a juvenile justice system or whether it's the adult justice system, we've got to start from the beginning, working with those individuals, preparing for their release, because that's going to happen, right? And the sooner we start planning, the better. But as Deja mentioned, there was clearly no reentry kinds of services or planning in her scenario. And I think that that's one of the things that we definitely need to do better here in Illinois. We need to work with those individuals. We need to work within those systems to ensure that we're preparing for that going forward. Programs like the CCBYS program that I spoke about can be helpful as it relates to youth leaving the juvenile justice system, because we have the ability to try to help resolve situations when placements disrupt for minor youth. We don't have, you know, we only work with minor youth. We don't have the ability to work with adults, or what would be considered adults, emerging adults in those situations. And as you heard, you know, when an individual simply being homeless is a sufficient reason to put them back behind bars. And that's, you know, if there's anything that we can do, it should not be that difficult to try to help ensure that an individual has, you know, a bed and a roof in order to keep them from going back into the system. They shouldn't have to do these kinds of demeaning things in order to continue to survive. And we've seen that with adults, emerging adults, and young people as well. And I could talk for days and hours, and I'm sure we don't have enough time for that, but I'm happy. I think, Dre, did you have a question for me?
Oh, I was just clapping to lift up that last point.
So I don't know if I strayed off topic too
What's on
much.
your wish list if you had more money?
A wish list for more money. Oh my gosh, where do you even start? So one of the things that I would love to see, I mentioned that we've just released our competitive funding notice for our homeless youth program, which is always the perfect time to see a large influx of cash, right? We can fund more programs and provide more services around the state. I would love for this really isn't so much about money, although everything in some way is about money, but we have a lot of areas within the state of Illinois, particularly in a lot of rural areas where we simply do not have any services, state-funded services for homeless youth. Certainly my passion is youth, but we talk about after-school program deserts, right? Where there's no after-school programs for kids. There's huge portions of the state of Illinois where we do not have services for homeless young people. And the numbers of homeless young people that we have in the state of Illinois, although I don't know what those numbers are, it's been a while since we've analyzed that. But simply looking at the number of known homeless students through the State Board of Education, there are far too many homeless kids around the state, particularly in rural communities where we don't have supportive services for them. Now, the CCBYS program that I mentioned, it is literally statewide. So those programs are available. But again, those are short-term solutions, and we need longer-term solutions for folks. A wish list, the wish list is simple. Fix it, right? The whole problem, fix it. But we need minds like the people that are on this call, and folks that are passionate about this work in order to move this ball forward. And I commend Deja, I commend Drea. You know, coming from within, you guys are making great strides in moving this work forward. You know, that's how we get there, one step at a time.
Thank you, Carrie. So let's move to Dre Kultz, Light Collective. Dre, from your perspective, working with young adult youth, what can Illinois do to operationalize Principle 5 to ensure that our youth and their families have the related services and supports to help them obtain and keep stable housing?
Yeah, so to speak to what Carrie just shared, obviously everything always does in some capacity come back to money. So if the mic got cut right here, just funding, but that funding also needs to be allocated in a way that is less restrictive, that more grassroots organizations and less quote unquote sophisticated programs are able to access, because a lot of those right there in the community are the ones providing the best, most authentic, culturally appropriate supports. And they may not have the infrastructure in place to implement the funding or to go for these major grants. You need funding for the brick and mortar to actually house, right? So units and facilities where folks have a place to rest their head, but also we need to prioritize the people who are, and obviously I say this very subjectively, but the people who are on the ground doing the work, so that it's sustainable, maintainable, so that we're able to continue this work for the long term. Burnout is very high. It's really hard to support others when you don't feel the ability to support yourself through salary or whatever. So prioritizing those pieces. It takes money to house people. It takes money to provide those authentic supports. The other piece is community education, right? We all sit on a lot of panels and group discussions like these, and we're surrounded by the choir. We're often preaching to the choir. So what does that look like, taking the conversation outside of these silos? And that's something that we could break down within our own sector, right? So the DCFS, Child Protective Services, and the court system, and the youth homeless sector, service providers, there needs to be communication happening there, but also breaking down stigmas to the community as a whole. We have, in any community, you're going to find the not in my backyard type of folks, that it sounds great on paper, but when the rubber meets the road, right? Allowing folks to sign a lease or breaking down those barriers to sign a lease, to move into housing, to stay in certain neighborhoods and areas, that takes community education. And I think about this in some of the Peace Circle training I've done. They speak a lot about the Maasai tribe in Africa, who's one of the most revered group of warriors, and historically, as well as still currently, the greeting that they have for one another, even folks who don't have children of their own, they greet each other by asking, "And how are the children?" And the measure of that entire society and that tribe is, it's based upon how can you respond to that answer. And so folks who are even not at this table should be able to take a look at how are we caring for our youth to really determine how is our society functioning. And I think based on the numbers that we shared here, we're really missing the mark. And that doesn't just change, change doesn't happen with just the well-meaning folks in this group. It's education to business owners who can provide jobs to folks with records, to housing providers, whether they're for-profit, landlord, or entity. I think that it's really important that they understand that, these folks, yes, might come with some challenges, but it's worth it. And here's a role that you can play in doing that. Also, once those housing opportunities are determined, it's making it low barrier. So like Deja said, when she got out, she needed her birth certificate. She needed social security card, all of those pieces, right? So many times I see young people being held up or passed up on housing opportunities because they don't have the documentation they need. And that is literally an arbitrary, thing that we have created, that we say you have to have your birth certificate before we can house you. How about we house you and then give you the supports you need to get this documentation? So really speaking to that housing first model. And then finally, I spoke to this earlier, but system collaboration. So supporting youth, a lot of the work that we do is supporting youth to get on housing wait lists, to make sure, no one should have to be an expert on the housing system. So making sure that, Deja and Drea both mentioned that they're not directly connected to someone who can walk them through that process. And I'm learning something new every day. And I think about if a young person that I'm connected to hadn't been connected to me or to Flora or, to Carrie's program, what happens when they hit their first no, or when they're missing their first document and they're just sent away. And now they're sleeping on the train or re-victimized, traumatized, or forced to make tough decisions as a result. And that's just from the securing. Then when we talk about maintaining housing, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. So at 18, Drea spoke to this, 17 to 18, all of a sudden we say that there's this huge shift and you should know how to live life. Like if any of us think back to our time at 23 years old, for me, it was the days of our lives. I didn't know about taxes. I didn't know about, what my credit score meant. And also the things that were mostly right in front of me. And I think for a lot of our young people, it's got to be developmentally appropriate. So to expect that just because you're unaccompanied at that point in your life, that you should have all the answers and be able to sign a lease and live independently, that's just not realistic. I share with my young people all the time, there's no finish line to life where you made it and you're doing it right. I still count on my network, and I'm long since a youth. Also allowing young people to identify safe communities with adequate amenities. So not just taking the first unit that we can get. A lot of our young people, when they have barriers to housing, like a criminal record, they're then stuck in a landlord situation where they're not, issues in their unit are not being addressed. It's inadequate because that person is desperate for that housing. And even some of the programs that we work with and support with, we see property managers take advantage of those situations. And then once you've identified all of that, a safe place to live, developmentally appropriate, with supports that come along with that. There's also, I know someone mentioned in the chat, cash assistance. We have an emergency fund at Light Collective that we were able to pilot during COVID. And it has made a world of difference. We've been able to help with court fees. We've been able to help folks keep their cell phone on so their PO can get a hold of them if necessary, so that they can call us when they're having a rough moment or need something. We've been able to help with transportation, so bus cards to get to court dates, even Ubers. And we've been able to just directly transfer cash to young people. And it's wild that they have been so conditioned to immediately submit a receipt back to show, hey, I just want you to know I spent it on the things that I asked. And that's huge. And then finally, community and relationship. Deja, you mentioned about your hired attorney, right? And that it was someone that you could relate to and that was able to actually identify in that way. A lot of times, when you're done with your public defender or your lawyer, that's it, you're done. That PO doesn't have, or the public defender, and then maybe the PO, I can never get a hold of our young people's parole or probation officers to see how can we support, how can we help with the stipulations of this. And that's, once they've left. And it's the long-term investment. And that circles back to how do we really support the folks who are on the ground doing this work so that they can stay in community with these young people, so that, someone in Deja's situation isn't getting passed from caseworker to caseworker, having to share their story over and over and over. And then they hit 24 years old and they can't go back to that space that was then their home. So it's the relationship building, it's a community building, and staying a part of that. And, you know, Deja's prime example, here she is saying, this is how I want to support others in this work, right? And Drea too. So like the power of that community, and recognizing young people, and I know Flora will speak more to this, but recognizing the power of young people to be experts in their own lives. You know, I think we let the funding dictate how we do the work, and then we do the work, you know, in that way. And then young people are subject to that. And it's time, you know, we flip the model and really make sure that young people are leading the charge, and that we eliminate some of these arbitrary restrictions.
Thank you, Dre. That was a very good presentation. But I think we're going to have to get ahead and give Flora a chance here.
I think Dre said everything I was going to say, but that's okay.
I'll bet you'll finish a few
Go
things.
ahead. You're going to do my
To
question.
address Principle 7, let me remind the audience, this is from your perspective, working with youth and their families. What can we do to ensure that the voices of youth are front and center as we develop and practice solutions to address this intersection between the justice system involvement and homelessness?
Okay, I have all the answers. Let me first, though, before I answer your question, I just had two comments to make. One is, if we really looked at economies and we looked at how much it costs to incarcerate a youth for a year, with 2 youth incarcerated, I could serve 50 people or 40 people in housing. Not as well as I'd like to. I'd like more money than that. But what I'm saying is, economically, it makes no sense to spend that money on incarcerating a youth who has done a nonviolent crime, and rather than spending it on the resources we need. And that would answer all of Carrie's issues about getting more money, or it would certainly help. Second issue that I'm going to address, and then I'll address the question, I absolutely promise, is that if you think an 18-year-old is an adult, you've never had an 18-year-old child. That when we make that distinction between you're suddenly an adult at 18, particularly if you're trauma impacted, particularly if you've had a lot of experience of abuse, neglect, or whatever else in your childhood, to say at 18, I didn't have that. And at 18, I was not an adult. So I even remember being 18, which is remarkable. So I think that it's really important to look at what we're defining. And now I'll get to the question I was asked, which one thing that Naomi said at the very beginning is that principle of youth involvement and youth voice is not a principle on its own. It's one that should be integrated in every one of the other principles and absolutely everything we do. And when you're asking what is the answers to making that work, I don't have one answer, but I'm going to start with one, which is respect. And I think when I say respect for the youth, I'm not talking, there's some of our funding sources that say we have to have youth involvement. They have to have a member on our board. We have to have this or that. And that's wonderful. I'm not saying anything bad about it. But when I say respect, I don't mean wanting to involve youth because our funders say we have to. I don't mean having to involve youth because politically it's correct. I don't want it to be a photo op. I want it to be that we really realize that the youth have so much to give in terms of their experience and their time that we want to have them involved. We have something to learn. Who can better tell us what works and what doesn't work in all of these principles, in all of our services, and all of our policies than youth have who are now experiencing homelessness, child welfare involvement, juvenile justice involvement, or any of these things, and homelessness. How could I forget homelessness? Or homelessness, who can better tell us than youth that's experiencing it now or who has experienced it in the recent past? They have the voice that we want to hear. They have something to say. And I think some of the ways of making sure that happens too, besides the respect, or a way of showing respect, is to give the message that their thoughts, their actions, can lead to action, not just to theory, not just to a paper. And I love the papers and the presentation, don't get me wrong, but I think that it becomes important to say your thoughts matter, because a lot of our youth, especially multi-system involved youth, have been told that they don't matter at all, that they have no value, their thoughts have no values, their dreams have no possibility of fulfillment. And so I think you have to say that your involvement in this process, your voice, your experience, your time, is vital, and it will make a difference, and your dreams can come true. And I think that's really important. Another sign of respect is called pay. I am actually on the clock as we talk. I'm getting paid for being here. Not saying I've never worked a Saturday or an evening or some time when I was not getting extra money because I cared, but I'm saying I'm getting paid. And I bet this audience would be much smaller if nobody in that audience is getting paid for this time too. So what I'm saying that to say is that if we are involving youth, and we need to, for their expertise and their time, we need to pay them. And we need to adequately pay them. And that would be no less than minimum wage. And I would hope more than minimum wage in a lot of cases, because they have valuable expertise and experience. Other ways is we need to make sure their needs are being met, because if we're asking someone to spend time and energy giving their expertise and advocating and teaching us, we need to make sure they have the housing they need. They have linkage to income. They have linkage to employment, including us employing some of the youth for jobs when those are available. But we need to make sure their needs are being met so that they can help us make sure the needs of their peers are being met. And that's really, really very important. And then I have this other remarkable thing, which is we really want to ask youth what they need and how to get there. I mean, want to know how youth can want to get there, we should ask them. If you want to say what works, ask them. And I think then encourage that we really care about what they say. And I have one more thing, and I want not to end it on a sad note, but I want to say that Deja and Drea, you are experience of what can work when we put things in place. And actually Luis had told me I should share a story of a youth that we served. It's not as happy a story, but the other end of the spectrum, if we don't address this, was a youth that was abused by, transgender youth, female to male, but was physically abused by his mother till the age of about 12. She had Munchausen, the mother had Munchausen's by proxy, shoved things into the child's urethra, did all of these things. He did not end up in child welfare till he was 12 or 13 years old, where a lot of the damage had already been done. I don't really know what happened exactly in child welfare, which should also, by the way, be in our conversations and system coordination going forward. But went from home to home and told us when he arrived at our transitional housing program at the age of 21, that he just had not learned how to live independently. He didn't really have a transition out of child welfare. He had been involved in trafficking and had been involved in juvenile justice and corrections because of trafficking activities, trafficking that he had to do to live, to survive. And we tried working, we got him at 21. We tried working with them. We got him with therapists that came to our facility, so he didn't have to go anywhere. He was with us on a tour. We did a hip hop tour, and he was there for his birthday, and he'd never had a birthday that he really enjoyed. But about 8 months into the program, the police came to our program and said that he had died down the road. They had told him he lived with us. I think of a drug overdose, we never were really told. It's worth the investment not to have that happen. It's the end of my story.
Thank you, Flora. So we got a little time here. I would like to have some of the panel members, freelance here a little bit, but I'm wondering if any of you, I gave Carrie an idea of if she had more money, if she had the wish list. Do any of you have ideas of things that you'd like human services to be doing that it isn't doing now? Nobody wants to jump in there?
I think Flora needs to unmute. There we go.
Which one? Are we doing a duet again, Ray?
Go for it.
No, I was going to say one thing, that it was mentioned that no low restrictions. A lot of our funding sources, i.e. HUD, and then look at really literal homelessness as one of the important things, which means you're literally homeless. That does not account for the people that are couch surfing and in very negative situations, but have a place to sleep last night. So I think making sure that we're either able to change some of the policies or create housing that has almost no restrictions really in terms of what literal homelessness looks like or what kind of homelessness you are, et cetera, would be one thing. And then making sure that we have enough housing, because we do not have enough housing, whether it's for minors or whether it's for 18 to 24-year-olds. And then making sure all the services are there, because there's a whole lot of things people need when they've been exposed to trauma. It can include therapy, but appropriate therapy, culturally appropriate therapy. I want to put some art things in place because I think that that's really good for someone to be able to express. I used to work with youth that when we did a play, I would say, when you perform up here, you get applause. When you act out there, you get arrested. So let's see how we can do this another way. So I think just a whole range of what the services can be, not just the traditional kinds of services, but sometimes some untraditional services. So that's some of the ideas I have. Now, Dre, your turn.
No, I think that that's true. I think that more emphasis, I mean, if there were endless dollars, we have to use a lot of our money keeping a very small staff that winds up being very crisis focused. And in a perfect world, and in what we are trying to create within our organization, but I think should be the goal citywide and universally, is services that address the whole person and create access to the arts and to those other pieces, you know, where passion lies. I think about when I was a high school art teacher on the South Side, and someone had mentioned earlier about like lack of after school programming. That's not just, you know, rural versus Chicago. It's North Side versus South Side versus West Side. My young people, my students didn't have a place to be after school. And the things that came and resulted from that, whether their parents were working or, you know, single family home, or they just didn't have the means and something to go home to. And now they're at a school that also is underinvested in. And so we don't have the programming and to try to have to put together fundraisers and things like that. So really investing in the passions and interests of whole people. And then I just want to echo over and over about the, you know, funding is great, but when it comes with restrictions that are not informed by the experts who are folks with lived experience, then it tends to not be best served. When we put time limits, on housing that are completely arbitrary and don't speak to the length of time that it takes to get something done, whether it's increasing income or working through trauma, then all we're really doing is setting folks up for another round of instability.
So I agree with you, Dre. Which I added in part of my remarks is, you know, you can't put a time on homelessness. And I was homeless, you know, enough times where, you know, there was no way I could tell the principal, oh, give us 30 days, or this is, you know, let me tell my grown mother, this is what she needs to do, you know. So I would say, you know, we need to think about the time frame, even like emergency shelters. I remember my first internship as a social worker was at emergency shelter. And I was in Wisconsin, Janesville, and I remember them, I had to tell a family that they had to leave. And I died. Like I cried with them. At first I'm like, okay, and your 30 days are up now. And I didn't know how to talk with them about it. And if anything, I'm trying to say, hey, can we figure this out? And they're like, I'm sorry, our funding restrictions, or we don't have enough money. And so like when I talk to people about, you know, no time limit, they say, but Drea, there's too many people that need the services. So you're cycling people in and out the system. They get their 30 days and then they leave and then they come back. You keep seeing them. So the solution is permanent housing. That's one of the main solutions, and supportive services so people can keep their housing.
Yes, I know from dealing with the Coalition for the Homeless during these years that always it comes back to permanent housing, creating more housing for folks. And I don't know, Flora, do you want to mention that there is an idea afoot on how to do that here in Chicago?
There's many ideas, but of more permanent housing, well, one is to get more money. There's the Coalition for the Homeless, Sam should be talking about it, but they are trying to get the real estate, a portion of real estate tax on homes over, and I haven't been doing a good job being at the meetings recently, but over quite a large amount, that a portion of that goes to support housing and permanent housing. So that's one way of doing it. Deja, you're nodding your head, you might know the exact amount. Because it's called the Bring Chicago Home campaign of the Coalition for the Homeless. And they want to use very high priced real estate, the tax on that, to help bring in permanent housing. So that's one way. But by the way, my shelter director also told me I should mention shelters being open 24/7. So that she will speak to me tomorrow. I'm going to mention that some of the youth shelters are only from 8 at night to 8 in the morning. And where do people go during the day? And it won't be juvenile justice, but it will be corrections if they get arrested for not knowing what to do during the day. And that creates a problem and less opportunities for services. I mean, who's going to do a service at midnight? You're not going to do any of the things you need. You're going to sleep, hopefully. So I'm mentioning that because Ann will kill me otherwise. But permanent housing, I think that's one of the ways is to really look at all of these different possibilities. But Bring Chicago Home, I mean, that's certainly one way that's not going to hurt anybody. At the real estate, at the rate that the real estate is, that they would put that tax, these are people who could afford that little bit of extra money. These are people who could make a difference. And when you think of what it will save the community in corrections, in juvenile justice, in many of the other things, by just doing that so someone could have a stable permanent home, and services could be included as needed with all of that. And I don't know if that answered your question, but those are certainly ways. I think, I wish it didn't include money, but it's really hard to do any of these things without money. And I will echo what Dre said, that we don't pay our staff enough. And so that, I mean, we want to pay them more. I have staff that work at slightly more than minimum wage, and they might have to deal with all kinds of different things, not because that's what we want, but because that's what we can have. So I think that's really important, that we do need money, but Bring Chicago Home would be one way if you support that. And you can read about it anywhere and see what that takes. And they have brought that to the city council. So if it would pass, and I think they brought it in the state in the past. So that would be one way.
Yes, I just wanted you to put in the plug. Thank you very much.
I did the right thing. Good.
There you go. There you go. Well, I think we can move to our last segment here. You know, for those in the audience, you know, we wouldn't just like let you go without trying to draw you in further. So we're going to have a call to action here, and Deja and Dre are going to come back on and deliver that message.
Thanks, Mark. So thank you, everyone. What an excellent presentation and discussion. It was definitely a great learning experience. And it feels good to learn, it feels good to leave here knowing about this issue and possible solutions. But that's not all we want you to leave here with today. We have a very diverse, committed audience with us, and we all have a role in moving these principles forward and making them a reality. As a city, as a county, and as a state, we can come together within our networks and build upon our strengths and talents to make an impact to improve the lives of homeless youth involved in the justice system. Today, we don't just want to feel good about moving the work forward, but we cannot make change and support the youth who need it most without each and every one of you and us taking action together. Whether you are a policymaker in law enforcement, a service provider, a funder, or simply a concerned citizen, there is a way for you to act. So we have created a call to action, some call to action steps that will be provided. I believe Luis should have put them in the chat, or he will now. And I will hand it over to Deja to give a quick review of those action steps.
Yes, we just want to thank everyone. And this is an opportunity where everyone can get involved. And the link is in the chat. Let me check to see. Hold on.
right, he put it on the screen. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I got it. So we're in the youth homelessness, addressing the intersections of youth, legal system involvement, and homelessness, principles for change. Sponsored by the Center of Juvenile Justice, Juvenile System Initiative, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission. These are just a few steps, like require just your email. There's different questions that you can, like a questionnaire. How can you help the fight to end youth homelessness? Just your name, your answer, your email. My organization is just fill that out, organization affiliation, and also just your contact information that will be that you can submit, that we can further keep up with you guys after this is over with.
And the action steps are?
Let me see. I don't see that. I might have to get closer. Okay. My action steps. I really can't see.
I can do it. It's
this.
okay. It's okay, Deja, if you want. Essentially, it just says how can you help to fight to end the homelessness, and we have a few different options. So you can receive an email for action alerts. So as things come up, whether it's maybe legislation or an event or information or a notice of funding, however, you could hear about ways to take action. You can share this information you learned today with your colleagues in the field. That's the one thing, like, yes, we can preach among the choir, but we have to get this conversation beyond this group. Help with legislative advocacy as that creates itself, and joining a statewide working group to help craft legislation. And lastly, attend a future event on youth homelessness. So those are all the ways that you're able to take action. And if you could please fill this out before you leave us today, that would be great. All right. So
Again, I thank all of our panel. Again, I'll give the applause here. And I also want to thank those audience members who have stuck with us through all this. And I think we're going to end it a little early here, a couple minutes, but we would hope that those of you who are on the call do fill out the form before you sign off and leave the meeting. And I want to thank everyone. Anybody else got anything to add here from the team?
Thank you. Thanks for hosting, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thank you. And thank everybody. And I really do hope that the people that have been here all day will decide that they want to be part of this action, because it's really important. If we solve youth homelessness, then adult homelessness might be less intense down the road if we do it effectively, as opposed to just housing temporarily.
And Anne, we made a note of your comment in the chat box about the Jimaway Village Youth Shelter. It's the only transitional age shelter on the south side, and that they're only open from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And she's saying that they need to be open 24/7.
See, now she didn't have to kill me because we brought it up, so that's good. She wouldn't kill me. I'm just being facetious.
Right. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.